Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Murray Rankin. I'm the Attorney General and Minister responsible for housing. I want to acknowledge first that we're gathered on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples today. I'm joined today by Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General Mike Farnworth, as well as Colin Basran, who is the Mayor of Kelowna and the co-chair of the BC Urban Mayors Council. Also with us virtually are the authors of the report under the consideration, Dr. Amanda Butler and Doug Lepard, who are the experts on the investigation that led us here today. During the meetings with members of the BC Urban Mayors Council last year, our government heard about some of the safety challenges, the public safety challenges that are facing us across our province. And we asked them for data to help us address those challenges together. People have a right to feel safe in the streets of their communities, both large and small, in our province. While overall crime rates have declined, communities have been dealing with challenges linked to repeat offending. That's criminal activities from a small number of people who are disproportionately committing crimes in our neighborhoods, as well as unprovoked, often violent stranger attacks. This crime is highly visible, and whether it's property crime or violent crime, it has a profound impact on victims and their feelings of safety in our province. While some have tried to claim there are quick fixes, we knew it was a bigger problem than that. So we hired two experts to investigate what we can do at the provincial level to address this. Dr. Amanda Butler. She's a researcher, a health researcher, and a criminologist with specialization in mental health, substance use disorders, criminal justice systems, and prison health as well. Also, we commissioned Doug Lepard, who is the former Vancouver Police Department Deputy Chief. He has authored several reports and made several sets of recommendations related to issues of crime and police response. So today, we are releasing their findings from their independent research report, an executive summary, and those 28 recommendations that they have made. The expert recommendations confirm that these evolving crime trends that I've mentioned are very complex challenges. They're compounded, of course, by the pandemic. They are tied to recent changes in federal criminal legislation, as well as decisions from the Supreme Court of Canada that bind, of course, both the Crown and the police. And they highlight the very real need to continue investing in social and health supports that our government has been rebuilding after a decade and a half of cuts. With that, I'll invite my colleague, Mike Farnworth, Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General, to say more about the recommendations. Minister Farnworth.
Thank you, Attorney, and I want to thank everyone for being here today, and also to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And as has already been said, everyone deserves to feel safe in their homes, businesses, and streets everywhere in our province. That's why our government partnered with the BC mayors in May to launch an investigation to understand the drivers of this criminal activity. Today's recommendations from Amanda Butler and Doug Lepard will inform future actions to address these challenges. And I want to thank both of them for delivering comprehensive suggestions on a complicated problem in a very short time frame. This report confirms the complexity of the challenge and highlights a range of measures that could help to improve safety in our communities. Many of the recommendations fit with work that we already have underway. And we're going to continue our work with our partners, including the BC Urban Mayors Caucus and the BC First Nations Justice Council, to identify how we can move quickly to implement further changes to help keep our communities safe. The report shows how important our investments have been. Things such as supports for people coming out of prison, complex care housing, and Indigenous courts and justice centers, but also just how much more we have to do. While we have work to do, and many partners must be engaged in this issue, it's clear from today's recommendations that we will be moving in the right direction. Currently, my ministry funds 17 situation tables across BC. These are community-based teams that bring together frontline staff from the public safety, health, and social service sectors. They work together to identify vulnerable individuals who may commit criminal offenses or experience harm and rapidly connect them to the services they need. The experts suggest that these tables could be used to build back an important tool that was canceled by a previous government. The report identifies that the prolific offender management pilot programs were an important evidence-based tool that were scrapped in 2012. We have been working to build back a comprehensive system of mental health and addiction services to get people the help that they need and to help keep our streets safer. And we have new services rolling out now that are aligned with the recommendations and that the report tells us will make a difference on the ground. New civilian-led peer-assisted care teams launching in Victoria and New Westminster this fall, and an expanded team on the North Shore. Complex care house opening across the province, providing a higher level of care for people who need it, including those with acquired brain injuries. 2 new Indigenous justice centers, and an announcement next week about improving care and transition supports for people who've been incarcerated. The recommendations show how much more work, though, we have to do. We've identified 3 specific recommendations that we want to start on right away. A return of the prolific offenders management pilots that were cut by the previous government, a dedicated provincial committee structure to coordinate service planning for people with complex health needs who come into conflict with the law, and the BC First Nations Justice Council's proposed pilot program based at the Prince George Indigenous Justice Centre to address recidivism amongst First Nations people. We understand and share people's concerns about repeat offending. Addressing the challenge will require ongoing commitment from all levels of government, as finding solutions to these complex issues is a shared responsibility. Today's findings will help us guide us as we continue to support effective enforcement, because enforcement is a critical component of this issue. And to rebuild a system where people get the health and social supports they need to break the cycle of offending, so that we can all live in safer communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Farnworth. We're very thankful for the advocacy and support of the BC Urban Mayors Caucus as we worked collaboratively to address this critical issue. And so now to provide his perspective on the recommendations that were released today, I'd like to invite Colin Basran, who is the co-chair of the BC Urban Mayors Caucus, and of course, the Mayor of Kelowna, to say a few words. Colin.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Minister Farnworth and Minister Rankin, for asking me to stand with you today. I too would like to respectfully acknowledge that we're standing on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is really good news, and really honored to be here to be with the two of you to announce these recommendations. And I'm here today to support and applaud this path to action for improved public safety and crime reduction that our communities desperately need. On behalf of my co-chair colleague, Mayor Helps of Victoria, and my peers, the BC Urban Mayors Caucus, welcomes and supports the recommendations within the Lepard-Butler report, commissioned by the province through the Attorney General's office. When we first raised the issues, as you heard about, with then Minister Eby last December, and provided follow-up data this spring, it was clear that the province was serious about taking action, and here we are today. As the 13 mayors representing 55% of British Columbians, we hear, know, and share our residents' frustrations. From repeat property offenders, and in some of our communities, the unprovoked random attacks, these crimes have a deteriorating impact on our residents' sense of safety and their confidence in the justice system. We know change takes time, but change cannot happen without these foundational steps we're announcing today. Today's announcement was paved through collaborative dialogue between the BC Urban Mayors Caucus and both the Attorney General and Solicitor General's offices, guided through an informed approach provided by our police agencies and with the professional expertise of Doug Lepard and Dr. Amanda Butler. We are pleased to see a number of recommendations capture the concerns we raised for our communities, but none more so than the recommendations where health and justice intersect, including the immediate work by the province on a dedicated provincial committee structure for coordinated service planning. We are keen to see the implementation of both today's actions and of the continued recommendations, including civilian-led mental health response teams and the boldly proposed new secure therapeutic facilities that can provide a no wrong off-ramp path of support, care, and treatment for those whose criminal activity is a symptom of severe mental health and substance use conditions. We are confident that accountability, justice, and safety, adequate care, and consequences will come out of the implementation of these recommendations that, as you've heard, include increasing Crown Counsel and probation resources dedicated to repeat offender cases, and the announcement of both the support for Indigenous-led programs and solutions through the BC First Nations Justice Council and the return of the Repeat Offenders Management Program. Through ongoing collaboration between all levels of government, we are confident that positive change will occur. Today, we are taking the first steps together, and we look forward to seeing how continued investments, including through the next budget, along with bold policy by the province, will see these and the remaining recommendations come to life in ways that our residents will see and feel. As the Mayor's Caucus, we will continue to be a voice for impactful responses to crime in our communities, to help ensure that some of the most vulnerable residents get the help they need to break the cycle that leads to repeat offending. And we will continue to be a collaborative partner with the province, working to keep all British Columbians safe. As co-chair of the BC Urban Mayor's Caucus and as Mayor of Kelowna, thank you again, Minister Rankin and Minister Farnworth, your ministries, and the province for taking these steps to improve public safety. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mayor Basran. I really appreciate that. And the words that I heard loud and clear were the words collaboration. The word collaboration appeared many times in your remarks. And to me, I think that stresses the fact that we're all in this together, the province, municipalities, and of course, the federal government. As I've mentioned, the recommendations clearly state that provincial Crown Counsel and police are bound. So of course, we all are by the law. They're bound by the federal criminal code amendments and the case law that interpret and apply that. And so we have raised the issue for reform with the federal government on many occasions. And I am happy to say that I will be meeting with Attorney General Lametti, responsible for the Criminal Code of Canada. And my colleague, Minister Farnworth, will also be meeting with Mr. Mendicino, the Federal Public Safety Minister, within a couple of weeks in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And you can be sure that we will have these recommendations at hand. And you can be sure that we will be bringing to the federal government's attention their need to collaborate with us as we talk about issues such as bail and sentencing, which of course are in their bailiwick and that of the courts. I look forward to the conversation with them about how we can get the federal government to support our work in a meaningful way. Our government, our provincial government, is determined to rebuild the network of support that people need to just break the cycle of offending that Mayor Basran has just referred to. We're going to work to improve the safety and well-being of our communities so we can build a better, safer British Columbia for the future. And with that, we're happy, and the panel is happy as well, to take any questions that you might have. I'll now to Marlon Behrens, who will moderate the media Q&A.
Thank you, Minister. A reminder for media on the phone to please press *1 to enter the queue. That's *1 to ask a question. Please also remember to take your phone off mute. You will not be audible until your name is called. For media in the room, please line up at the microphone provided and wait to be called. Please make sure to provide your full name and outlet. Media will be limited to one question and one follow-up. We will be starting in the room today. If we have any questions in the room, please go ahead.
I'm Patterson from CTV Vancouver. I'm hearing a lot of compassion for offenders, for people with mental health struggles, perhaps brain injuries. I think some people would say, where's the compassion for the people who are being victimized, the businesses that are having their windows smashed again and again and again, people who are being attacked by strangers on the street? Where's the compassion for them?
Compassion for them is a commitment that we make as local governments and as the provincial government to address the concerns head on that they have raised. This concern came to us from the urban mayors, and not just urban mayors, but smaller communities as well. Leaders from those communities who've told us that people in their community are feeling a lack of safety. And we need to understand that. We need to work hard together to make some of the changes we need. many of which, as you say, are grounded in mental health and the lack of support over the years for people with mental health. But we have to show compassion for those communities by our action, by collaboration at every level of government to address this challenge head on. And that is what we're committing to do today.
Would you like to see stricter prison sentences for somebody who is a prolific repeat offender who is consistently turned back onto the street to offend again?
Those are the kind of changes that obviously are needed. We also need to reconsider the bail approach in Canada, which the Supreme Court of Canada has said involves allowing people back more quickly. That there has to be a very good reason to keep them in jail. The principle, of course, is that they will be released unless there's some good reason to do the opposite. And so we have that problem with people who are on bail who are offending. And the Crown Council's hands are tied by Supreme Court of Canada judgments on that, and by the criminal code amendments that took place in 2019 in Bill C-75, a federal law. We have to address those changes head on. I mean, there are problems with sentencing. Yes, that could be part of the solution, again, in the hands of the independent judiciary. But we need to make sure our federal colleagues understand what's going on in our communities so we can work, as I said earlier, in a collaborative way to address these issues head on.
Do we have any more questions in the room? We'll turn it over to the phones. Our first question on the phone is Katie DeRosa, Vancouver Sun. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is for Mr. Lepard and Dr. Butler. One of the measures that was recommended, or that was asked you to look into in May, was first of all, the ability to give the courts the power to require electronic monitoring for repeat offenders, and also looking into mandatory treatment for individuals struggling with mental health and addiction challenges. I know obviously that's not in the recommendation, so could you explain why you didn't go with either of those methods, and if you looked into those at all, and what you found about the consequences or the downfalls of both of those?
So I will take the first question on electronic monitoring, and I'll leave the second question for Amanda. But although it's not reflected in the recommendations, we did look extensively into the issue of electronic monitoring, and you'll find that in our full report. There isn't a recommendation around electronic monitoring because it's actually already in use. When the new revamped electronic monitoring program started in basically January of 2016, there were 43 people that were subject to electronic monitoring. Today, there are around 300 at any given time. And so electronic monitoring is not a panacea. It is useful for some offenders in some circumstances. For example, a sex offender can be geo-fenced away from parks and schools and playgrounds and that sort of thing, and an alarm will go off immediately if they go into those areas. It's useful for people that have a curfew, but there are technical challenges. It also requires that people have a home generally, so that's a problem for some offenders. And it's of no use when you're talking about an offender who has a condition, for example, not to possess tools or not to be in a parking lot. Electronic monitoring can't tell whether there's a breach of those conditions. So we do write about it extensively, actually, in the report, because it was part of the terms of reference, but we simply don't have any recommendations to make because it is being well used now in BC, and there was no information to suggest that Crown Council aren't asking for electronic monitoring for the right offenders in the right circumstances.
Katie, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, was Dr. Butler going to address the mandatory mandatory treatment?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So with respect to compulsory treatment, we do talk about that a little bit in the report, and it didn't make its way into the recommendations because compulsory treatment really has not been robustly shown to improve health, particularly compulsory treatment for life-threatening substance use. What does sort of overlap, though, with that question is the recommendation around low secure care, which is something that we think is really important to consider, particularly for people who are involved in in extreme acts of violence and pose a public safety risk as a result of their substance use behavior or perhaps other mental health needs that they're experiencing. There are also mechanisms within the specialized court function that's not compulsory treatment, but is something that we might call legal coercion that has actually been shown to produce really positive outcomes in some circumstances, for example, through drug treatment court, where people are given the option to participate in treatment to avoid, for example, a jail sentence. So there's sort of a spectrum from compulsory treatment to other options, and some of that is discussed in more detail in the 150-page report that will be released later this month.
Katie, now do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to ask Minister Farnworth this question. You know, the jumping on the prolific offender management program right away. Obviously, we know you mentioned it was scrapped by the Liberals in 2012. I mean, is this an attempt to embarrass the Liberals for scrapping the program, considering they have been the most vocal critics of the NDP? They quote catch and release system. So is it a bit I guess political opportunism to jump on this particular recommendation right away to sort of, is it a way to embarrass the Liberals for scrapping it in the first place?
It's a recommendation and a report that we had commissioned because we understand how important the safety of communities and the public feeling safe in their own communities is. And this is a key recommendation in the report. That's why we want to move on it very quickly. This is about being community safe. This isn't about embarrassing anybody. This isn't about embarrassing previous governments. Their record speaks for itself. This is about community safety and making people feel safe in their communities. And it's about collaboration with local mayors who have come to us and said, we have a problem. Stories that we've all seen, whether it's in large communities or small communities, mid-sized communities, about repeat offenders, about the random violent attacks, and how can we do that? How can we deal with the situation? And that's what these recommendations are about. And this is how we can start moving very, very quickly.
Our next question is from Rob Shaw, Check News. Please go ahead.
Hi, could we go back to the low secure unit idea? There's a couple of references in the summary. One says that it would require federal legislation for a restricted patient model. And then the other says BC should just create it. And I'm just wondering if someone could clarify, can BC do the involuntary care low secure unit idea on its own? Does it need Ottawa to do it? And how realistic do we think that would be that they would partner in that?
I wonder if I could go to the panel to elaborate on the recommendation in that regard.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. So the province can, in fact, unilaterally move on the low secure care units. This is something that could be actioned under the Mental Health Act. The restricted patient laws, that's something that's separate. So that's based on the UK model that would give the courts more options within the criminal code to allow people to actually be sentenced to hospital. So in Canada, we have, an NCRMD regime, so people are not criminally responsible, but it requires a very, very high threshold of mental disorder severity at the time that somebody is involved in an offense. And so you are either responsible or you're not responsible. But there are other countries and jurisdictions in the world like the UK that have concepts such as diminished responsibility, whereby you can acknowledge that the severity of somebody's illness is in fact implicated in their offending behavior, and you want to give the courts more tools and more options to support them in diverting people away from the criminal justice system. So that recommendation is really exploratory and would really require the province to advocate on behalf of the federal government to amend those laws. So that's really a long-term recommendation. The low secure care units, that's an idea that would allow us to really build out the continuum of care we have for people, particularly for people that have very complex needs that result in high behavioral needs and violence that cannot be managed within local hospitals and tertiary settings. So we really only have have in BC one forensic psychiatric hospital that's located in the Lower Mainland. And so for anybody who is sort of meeting that threshold, they have to travel from across the province, and we simply don't have the capacity to meet that need. And so the low secure care units would be to support those folks who maybe are being admitted to hospital, and they require a higher threshold of security, not just to protect the public, but also to protect themselves. I think that we have a lot of conversations about what people need to be protected from, but we also have to talk about the rights that people should have access to, and people should be able to access care within a setting that's actually designed therapeutically to meet their needs, and that's staffed appropriately to manage their behavior so that they're not, deteriorating in segregation and settings like that. So the low secure care units can absolutely be actioned by the province without the federal government.
Rob, did you have a follow-up?
Sure, that's great. Thank you for that. Just to the Attorney General, this report seems to highlight the many problems in the justice system, Crown, resources, but your own Assistant Deputy AG released a very long statement the other week for the public saying system isn't broken. And I just wonder how you execute the kind of major reforms we're talking about today when it doesn't look like your own ministry leadership appears to agree on the extent of the problem that this report highlights.
Rob, I wouldn't agree with your characterization of what the Assistant Deputy Attorney General Peter Juck said in his summary. But in terms of the budget, I'll start by saying since 2017, the budget of the Crown Counsel Office has gone up by 32%, almost a third. And there's been call for additional budget allocations in this report, which I'm sure the Independent BC Prosecution Service will undertake and examine. As for what the Assistant Deputy Attorney General said, I think he was stressing the need that we as a community have confidence in our criminal justice system, that there are things that they are constrained by Supreme Court decisions and by federal criminal law that they must do. And I think his message, as I read his summary, was that there are many things that we need to do as a community that don't involve the criminal justice prosecution service as much as they deal with some what we might call the upstream concerns, the things that Dr. Butler just referred to and Mr. Lepard as well. Investments in things like the kind of homelessness issues that we need to address head on in our communities, investment in so many of the other health and mental health services that people so desperately need. That's what I thought he was saying in his report.
Our next question is for Richard Zussman, Global. Please go ahead.
For either minister, and Minister Rankin, you just made a mention to people feeling safe in their own communities. How is the province going to measure whether people feel safer due to these changes? And how quickly do you expect that these changes will start changing that sense of safety in our downtown cores?
I'll ask the Public Safety Minister to address that.
Thanks for that question. I think on a number of fronts. One, the recognition by the public that the province and local governments are taking this issue very seriously and have come forward with this report with a number of recommendations based on the work of experts in terms of things that can be done and implemented. Second is ensuring that we are following through on the recommendations. That's why we've made the announcements that we have today on the 3 areas that we want to move on immediately. And finally, is by things working, by people feeling safer in their neighborhoods, by seeing a reduction in the kinds of random attacks that we have seen, by seeing a reduction in the situations where we've seen the break-ins into businesses and by the crime stats going down, by police being out there and doing what they've already been doing, which is enforcement, by the system working the way that it should, and the efforts being undertaken on a collaborative way to address this issue.
Richard, did you have a follow-up?
For Mayor Basran, I know this has become a prevailing issue in municipal elections across the province in the big urban areas. No doubt, I haven't been to Kelowna yet, but I'm guessing you're having to defend your record on public safety in your community. I know it's happening in Vancouver, in Surrey, in Victoria, and other places. Do you believe that the changes today will allow for municipal governments to make the argument to their electorate that things are going to get safer?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I certainly do, because a lot of actually the majority of the things that we as municipalities have been calling for or asking for are in these recommendations. And back maybe to your earlier question, through things like point in time counts, for example, in Kelowna, there are 15 individuals in our city responsible for over 1,000 touches with police last year. Our RCMP officers know who these individuals are. So how do we track this, or how do we know that improvements are being made? Because we can track the outcomes of those 15 individuals, and through various things like complex care, getting people into homes and getting the supports that they need. We know who these people are. We know their names. We have the data. So it's going to be very easy, I think, to be able to report out and see where we're making progress and see where we're not, and to continue to advocate for change. But again, this comes down to collaboration. And I think what's really important about today from the BC Urban Mayors Caucus standpoint is it's very hard for us mayors to tell a business owner who's had their business broken into time and time again to say, well, it's out of our hands. All we can do is enforce through policing, but mental health, addictions, housing don't fall under our jurisdiction. Our residents don't care whose jurisdiction it is. They just want to see action. And that's why today is so important, is because collaboratively, we now have a path forward. There are implementation recommendations being implemented today. And I can guarantee that the BC Urban Mayors Caucus will continue to work with our provincial government and advocate with our federal government on making sure the rest of those recommendations are followed through. Yes, I know that some of them are long-term, but at the end of the day, we are finally on the right path. And so I am happy going home to be able to explain to our residents that we are being taken seriously, and there are measures that are going to have the outcomes that we're hoping for.
Our next question is for Leanne Young, CBC. Please go ahead.
Hi, so this question is for the researchers to start with. I just wanted to have you clarify something based on your executive summary there. So, I mean, we've heard even from today and stats from the BC Prosecution Service and Stats Canada that seems to suggest there's been a steady or even drop in crimes over the last year. But based on your assessment, are we actually seeing fewer crimes? You actually noted in your report that, there's been problems with the type of crime reporting that we've seen over the last 2 years. Is there actually a drop? Like, how would you characterize what situation we're in?
Well, first of all, it's not wrong that crime has been trending down in Canada for a number of years, overall crime, but it's actually quite misleading to just look at overall crime trends and conclude from that everything is basically fine, because there is real and justified distress in many communities. And it's important to note that, you really have to drill down in the statistic to know what you're looking at. So for the 5 years prior to the pandemic, the crime severity index in Canada actually increased every single year, meaning the seriousness of crime was increasing. Then when the pandemic hit, we saw significant decreases in large volume crimes like residential break and enters, because many people were working from home. And we saw large decreases in theft from auto because people weren't driving their cars into downtowns to work. But these big trends can obscure upward trends in specific types of crimes in specific locations where crime congregates. And because decreasing property crime is the largest component of crime stats, it can obscure increases in violent crime in specific areas. And I'll give you a perfect example is the 45% increase in serious assaults and assaults involving weapons, and a 60% increase in weapons offenses around the Hastings Street encampment in Vancouver in just the last few months. We've all seen the stories about the increases in racist graffiti, businesses having their windows smashed repeatedly. And there's also a fair number of offenses that are not reported or underreported, or they're captured in non-criminal statistics, such as Mental Health Act apprehensions for people that are a danger to themselves or others, which have been increasing exponentially, and so have the hospitalizations. And so, virtually everyone we interviewed, street nurses, mental health workers, staff at the downtown community courts, mayors, police officers, described what's quite obvious, which is the increasing intensity of disorder and aggressive behavior in downtown areas across BC, not just in big communities too, like Vancouver and Victoria and Kelowna, but we also heard about it in small communities like Seashelt and Langley and other smaller communities. So, and when it comes to stranger attacks, of course, in the whole scheme of things, those are small numbers, but they're very serious incidents. The VPD did an excellent job for us of putting data together, demonstrating that violent, unprovoked stranger attacks have increased by about a third compared to the pandemic. And it was a problem before the pandemic. And in our full report, we go into quite a bit of detail about why. And I'll just say, like myself personally, friends and colleagues I've talked to recently, including a BC Court of Appeal justice just walking to work, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you who walk in our downtowns have been victims of aggressive and threatening behavior, but didn't report it unless you were actually assaulted. So it's great news that crime overall is generally down in Canada, although it had been trending up before the pandemic, and I expect that it will trend up again as the pandemic winds down. But that doesn't change the fact that we have some very significant issues with some types of crime and disorder that are creating incredible distress in many communities. The mayors and others aren't imagining what they're seeing, and we think they should be commended for advocating for action in their cities.
Leanne, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I did. So this question's, thank you, Doug, for that. This question's for the Public Safety Minister. So the recommendation for the prolific offender management model, or repeat offender, as I should say, how is your government going to ensure that BC doesn't fall into the same challenges that the UK found themselves, which is where this approach has come from, that their agencies publicly stated in 2020 that their program had lost its way? How are you going to ensure that BC doesn't fall into some of the same issues?
Well, first off, one of the things about moving into a new program, as is in the recommendations, is you can learn from mistakes or challenges that other programs have had implemented. It's not unusual for any program. Once it's implemented, it starts off well, and then you start to see challenges. And what is key is to make sure that you have a commitment to addressing those challenges, resolving them, working with all the stakeholders, all the people who are involved in that, whether it be law enforcement, whether it be mental health workers, whether it be Crown, whether it be the local community, to identify if there's a challenge and fixing it. As we know, this is a long-term commitment that we need to make in terms of dealing with the situation that many communities are facing themselves with. And as a government, we're committed to doing that. It's why we agreed to work collaboratively with the mayors. It's why we've made it clear that when we go to Ottawa, both Minister Rankin and myself, to make it clear that the federal government has a role to play in terms of the bail conditions and the criminal code that they're responsible for. All of us have a role to play, and we all want to make sure that we're working together and recognizing that this is not just a press conference announcement, that's it. But when we're making these programs, that we need to make sure they work today, they work next year, they work 5 years from now.
Our next question is from Fran Muir, Northern Beat. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this question is for Dr. Butler. I'm trying to understand, like you said, there was no recommendation around mandatory treatment, but we do have low secured units, which seem like I can't really tell if that's similar to mandatory care or if it's the extreme end of complex care, like a locked long-term care kind of facility. Can you, and you mentioned there's legal coercion, jail or treatment that's in effect, although when he was Attorney General, David Eby did concede that that is obviously not working for these individuals in terms of the people that are repeatedly offending. Can you just sort of clarify for me what is low secure units? Is that mandatory care? Like, are people mandated to access that?
Yeah, so the low secure care units would generally be mandated care under the Mental Health Act, similar to how people can already be admitted to hospital under the Mental Health Act. But the low secure units would be facilities that would actually be designed with the proper security, therapeutic design, and staffing detail that you need for people who are presenting with extreme violent behaviors. So the kinds of things we have unfortunately seen in our communities, including machete attacks and really, really violent instances. And I want to be really clear that that's very different from the conversation around compulsory treatment for people who are presenting with life-threatening substance use that does not render them a risk to other people. So this wouldn't be for those folks. And I think that there's been some discussion, particularly in the media around that lately. So it would be that there would be a compulsory treatment regimen potentially, depending on what people are presenting with. But the reality is that the factors that need to be considered when somebody is presenting as an extreme danger to the public are very different than when somebody is presenting just as a harm to themselves. And so the low secure units would be for people to be mandated. Compulsory treatment, we know as a general rule, doesn't necessarily lead to improved health outcomes. However, I think it's really important that we have conversations about the quality and the appropriateness of care. I think the context in which a lot of this has been researched has been in the context of a completely inadequate system. And so there are inevitably concerns about whether people actually will get better, whether there will be improved public safety, because we don't have that continuum in place. And we've also seen, a history of non-compliance with the Mental Health Act that leaves people feeling really uncertain and I think mistrustful of the system. And so I think that those are the types of issues that we need to address. We didn't want to overstep in the 100 days that we had to do this report. Exactly what would be included in a low secure care regimen is yet to be determined, but there are national guidelines and standards that have been developed in other places, including the UK, who have developed best practices in this area where BC can certainly learn from.
Fran, did you have a follow-up?
I did. I think I would need a longer conversation with you, Dr. Butler. But for this next question, one of the ministers, I think, one of the issues, I'm not going to surprise anyone, is the lack of resources in terms of treatment. A number of these recommendations rely on being able to actually send people or have people access adequate treatment. How are you going to resolve that? Like, sounds like, as Evie said last week, not an insignificant amount of investment will be required. What's the government's plan there?
Well, I think that's true. This is going to be expensive to do right, and therefore we need to fold it into the budget cycle that's currently underway. There'll be budgetary consequences as a result of this, and so we look forward to speaking with our colleagues at Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance to make sure we can get the resources that are needed.
Our next question is from Martin McMahon, City News. Please go ahead.
A question for Ministers Farnworth or Rankin, based on these recommendations. Just to be clear, is it accurate to say your government will not pursue compulsory treatment for repeat offenders?
We are looking at the recommendation around the compulsory treatment and the issue of the low barrier that was identified in the report, and we will now be taking those recommendations and doing a deep analysis of them. That's why we've asked for the report, and we also await the final report, which will be coming later this month.
Martin, did you have a follow-up?
There are a lot of recommendations in here. Are there any recommendations in this report that are completely off the table? If so, which ones and why?
There are no recommendations in this report that are completely off the table. As I said, we've just received the report. We think it's a very positive report. It's been a report that we've asked for in collaboration with the BC Mayor, the BC Urban Mayors Caucus. And we've already said that we intend to take action very quickly on 3 of those recommendations. And we're very pleased with the report that we've seen to date.
We have time for one more question. We're going to come back to the room for our final question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for taking my question. This is Parmeet from Red FM. My question is regarding the victim's point of view. So sometimes due to random attacks, victim may suffer life-altering injuries or trauma, but the offender might be released on the basis of mental health issues. Is there any recommendation or will be there any recommendation to compensate the victim in any monetary or compassionate way?
Minister Farnworth.
Thank you for that question. What I can tell you is we have some pretty comprehensive victim of crime programs in this province that the provincial government funds through a number of sources, including from proceeds of crime. And so those programs are there for people who have been victims of crime to access.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. So sometimes the attacks are due to the random attack could be due to racial profiling. So is there any recommendation? Sometimes random attacks, like we see lots of attack on the buses in the public places, but they are usually due to racial profiling. Is there any recommendations on those issues as well?
In terms of racial hatred attacks, there's been a number of initiatives. One has been the racial data legislation that has been now implemented. The second is we have the ability to deal with those kinds of crimes through the criminal code, through hate crimes, in which prosecutions can take place on that basis. And at the same time, victims are also eligible for the victims of crime programs that we have in place in the province.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you, everyone, for joining.